What's up guys, Taylor Payton of tapeart.com and powerpainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters video. So in this video I am addressing a question in regards to shading the lower torso area. I have had a long-term subscriber who I believe is based on the Left 4 Dead character ask me how to kind of get the shading looking correct in that particular area. And for me, it's not so much about understanding all the anatomical bits and the muscles and whatnot, but just knowing how the forms are going to look in various lighting scenarios. I'm going to sketch a couple quick torsos here for you, and then we're just going to shade them in. I guess a lot of the tutorials, according to the comment that Bill Overbeck, quote unquote, left, all kind of revolve around very six-packed dudes or women, and I'm guessing what he's looking for is people of more average sort of anatomy. So we're going to keep it not too toned, not too exaggerated, and we're going to have some simple lighting scenarios so that you can kind of follow along. I always feel just slightly weird about sketching anatomy in its like isolate parts as opposed to actually drawing the head and all that stuff. So here is a quick male torso, not super ripped, just a little bit of subdivision so we can actually see where the muscles are, where the navel is, things of that nature. Up here you have the pecs, then we go to the uppermost sort of abdominal region and slide down the midline into the lower abdominal region, which we're going to be shading. And what I'm going to do first and foremost is I'm just going to apply a flat fill. So we'll quickly just run the contour here using the lasso tool for the selection. Doesn't have to be perfect. And there's that. After which we now have a base tone, right? So it's about an 8 on the value scale. So we can start with shadows first. I'm going to knock it down from 77 to 47, which is a differential of 3. And so what that basically means is we're going to have just a reasonable amount of contrast, but not like a ton, right? So in that regard, let's pick a light source and where our light's going to be coming from. So I'm going to drop this tone right here so I can color pick it later, and I'm going to say that we're going to have a pretty top-down light source. So light's coming from above this bust, if you will, and we're going to just isolate some areas and shade them. So the simplest way to shade, as in the most kind of stylized way, is simply to divert to just a two-tone separation. So a darker tone and a lighter tone. I have my dark tone right here. I can use the lasso tool like I did to sort of pick some areas that I want to have shadow shapes appear. And so in that regard, I'm going to just pick my biggest shadow shapes first. And immediately you'll be able to see the forms turning because we're effectively showing the areas where there's less light. So on a new layer, which is above my fill layer, I'm going to add another fill and drop this shadow in. Now already it's kind of rough edged because the lasso tool makes 1 pixel sharp edges, but we have our first subdivision of light here, and that makes it so that we can actually start to pull form out of what is essentially a flat. We call them flats when we're just doing these sort of really simple tonal separations. And I'm going to just do a couple more of those. I have my big shape, so I'm going to focus on the smaller shapes now. Usually we catch a little bit of it in the belly button. No light's going to be getting in there. And I'm just trying to think of where the light is falling based on this sort of imaginary light source over here. And again, since he's not too ripped, we're not going to see a ton of division. We're not going to see like the bottom parts of abs and all that stuff. We're not going to stylize it too much. So now we have even more tonal separation. And I think just a few more shapes and we'll be good to start playing with some of the edges of the tonal separations. So this is a very graphic way of doing it, and I find that it's simple and thus easier to follow. So even when you're doing more realistic art, you're going to see that the simplest separations are often necessary in order to move on to the more complex ones. So again, we don't have a six-pack here. There's just enough body fat, or just the muscles are small enough so that we don't see a ton of definition. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the smudge tool, and it's just a super soft brush. I can start to maneuver these edges and kind of soften them up, give a much more natural look, way less digital. So I'm just going into these shadow shapes. I'm just smudging these edges, because wherever they're super sharp, they're going to look much more unnatural. But we want to have sort of a nuance of edge, meaning that the edge is going to be sharper at parts. For these particular shadow shapes, the contour of the shadow shape, the very edge, is going to be softest where the form is turning the roundest, and it's going to be sharpest where the form turns very drastically. Another way of saying that is wherein we have very stark transitions between the surface where light is hitting and there's a really sharp turn, like underneath the pec, for example, the pectoral muscle. We're going to see a sharper edge, whereas maybe the abdomen has the softest turning of form, and so we can have the softest edges by proxy. But a lot of it is just naturalizing the very sharp edges of our friend the lasso tool and the fill that resulted thereafter. So as you can see, we're already getting a slightly more believable look, even with just two value separations. We're going to need more value separations in order to give a fuller look and a more realistic look. So there's a couple ways we can approach that. We can pull upward from this, which is probably not the best option, since we want to go and add shading first so we know what is in shadow. And the way I'm going to do that, or rather expound upon that, is I'm going to grab and color pick this so I know that we're having a differential of 3. I'm going to move that down all the way to 37 as opposed to 47, or at least around that area. So now we can hit the hardest part of the shadow, which is the terminator. And or at least that's what it's called in academic sort of painting. I'm actually going to soften the edge of my brush for this, because if I go in with just the hard round brush, it's going to be as stark as that lasso tool, and thus we're going to have a little more work to naturalize it. So I'm just going to run some of these edges that I just sort of softened with a soft brush that's using a darker tone, an even darker tone. Effectively, we're painting inside the shadow. We're painting the form back even more so, because shadows are not perfectly opaque. That's why we soften the edge, so that we have a more gradual transition. We want a graduation of form as a result of our shading. And you can see that the old masters did this in amazing ways, and they took this to the greatest extremes. But you can even block in your shading with a semi-soft brush as well. It doesn't have to be with the lasso tool per se. And then I can start to transition out of these forms too, by having picking that middle dark value and sort of pulling some of the forms out, giving an even softer transition in certain areas, and just going in and painting a little more naturally, not using so many fills. Again, I'm just trying to spot and execute the areas where, or execute in areas where we have the least amount of light hitting. And the areas I want the shadows to transition a little differently. So the ridge of the stomach is kind of interesting in that we have these bonier protrusions which the rib cage makes up, and then you have all the organs that sort of rest beneath beneath the lungs, which the rib cage protects. So the abdomen is very soft, and that's why we protect it. Even if you have hard abs, it's still, softer than bone, just due to its molecular structure. And so we have to kind of take that into consideration when we're shading the abdominal cage, especially when it's not super stylized and muscular. So we're going to get a little bit of a form transition at the bottom. Let's do a couple brush strokes to help convey that. Probably get a little bit on this leg. Just some backlight a little bit. Helps sell the form. Add a little shading to the sternum. Make that more of a halftone. We have our light and our halftone and our shadows. So right now I'm kind of playing between the shadows and the halftones. This is a pretty stark transition, so I'm gonna kind of diffuse that a little bit. Use a little more halftone. And even in the shadows, we're going to have parts that have a little more definition, just not as much as the light. And again, we can pull a little higher just to add even more emphasis to the form, not necessarily the highlight, which is the sharpest, smallest part of the value scale when shading that you should reserve for such an occasion, but just adding little subtle form transitions to help really pull the volumes and the dimension. So if you wanted to be really academic with this, you could get an actual model to draw from, like go to a life drawing class and see the form transition. Oftentimes the models are not entirely ripped, so you'll get a lot of this sort of roundedness, this lifelike roundedness and volume, and that'll really help you sell realism if that's your goal. There are a lot of approaches to painting and understanding the fundamentals, but to apply them to a realistic caliber is no small feat. People pursue that their entire lives. So, alright, so let's kind of follow suit, except let's have a different value scale. I'm going to do a female torso, and we'll shade the lower area. In this one, I'm going to just approach it a little more naturally. I'm not going to do the same process of, light lines to a fill and all that. I'm just going to do it all with the brush and the smudge tool. So I'm going to block in a female torso, which again is basically like an hourglass or a flower bag. There's lots of things you can relate it to help you remember. Just some quick anatomical kind of tips between male and female. Women have more rounded forms and usually a shorter rib cage. Not necessarily, I guess shorter isn't exactly the right word, but more compact, a little more again rounded, oval-esque. It's not as angular as a male rib cage. The collarbone, the clavicle, also has more of a V shape to it, leading upward into the neck, whereas the male version has more of a straight line, more of like a scale, like a weighing scale. Let's go ahead and add some shoulder to upper arm points. And what's always really helpful to remember is you have this midline that basically divides our body symmetrically, and it really shows up usually in the abdominal area. So that's nice as a marker of bilateral symmetry. And female hips are definitely more voluminous than male hips. At least typically. Just going to exaggerate the proportions a little bit. All right. Again, I'm fighting my urge to kind of make it a little too low body fat for the purpose of the tutorial. I'm trying to naturalize things. I'm going to start this one over just so we have a better base to work from. Also kind of want a different angle. So we'll approach this one from even more of a 3/4 view. The male torso is a little bit more of a front, and I'll leave a little extra body fat at the soft sort of portion where all the internal organs are held in the abdominal area here, so that we can shade that very softly, and that will sort of help convey what this tutorial is about. So keeping it simple. Blocking in the forms. All right. That'll be sufficient. Okay, so as stated, I'm going to shade this one more naturally. What I'm going to do first is I'm just going to take the brush and increase the size. And just go ahead with my first pass of filling everything in so we have a base tone to work with. Still got that softness on the brush, which will make for some nice form transitions later. And I will paint out the lines to a good degree just to give it that extra kind of volume. I'm going to have the light coming from this direction. So we've established our light source. Let's talk shadow. I'm just going to make a new layer so I can flip it on and off. And I'm still going to draw out my shadow shapes before I actually paint them. And we're going to have starker shadow shapes this time. We're going to have much more of a value differential. So we'll call it, that's our big shadow shape. Then I'll just remind myself not to go all the way to the edge of my form, because that will flatten it. Because that's not how things look in real life. Usually shadows don't go all the way to the edge. There's a little bit of a light wrap around the volume. So now that I have that blocked in, I'm going to add that darker tone. Just go in nice and heavy with that basis. It's probably getting the least amount of light over here. Underneath the abdomen, between the legs. Alright, so even if we start fairly dark, we can always kind of bring it back later, and we will. So already there is a much starker difference if you squint. This torso demonstration has much more of a mid value range, whereas this is very stark. it has a lot more of a crushed, darker value range. So now I can begin to sort of paint within the shadow, still keeping it within the value range of the shadow. And I can think about some of the softer form transitions. Do a quick flip. And start to paint out some of my lines as well. So I'm thinking more about shadow shapes than I am about delineation of line. It's important to be able to think in various visual capacities on different visual trains of thought, if you will. I go into that with my beginner drawing course and my beginner painting course. You can find links to those at the bottom of the description box if that's something you're interested in. Just sort of learning to wield these fundamentals in a way that allows you more freedom and gives you the mental models to start building your proficiency in those particular fundamental veins. So now I'm just painting opaquely, kind of color picking and transitioning the forms where I see fit. This is a really dark transition, so I'm kind of going to lighten that up even in my shadow space. And see, that's a very sharp edge right there, so we're going to soften that as well. Paint out some of the lines. You can still have a good degree of realism with not a ton of, with some lines. It all comes down to things like the proportions and how accurate your shadow shapes are. So don't think that just line is going to be the deciding factor of whether something you're making has the tones of realism you're looking for or not. So let's talk a little bit about this lower torso area. I'm going to flip again here. We have the navel, which is pretty stark and dark, definitely more of an occlusion shadow. The super dark places are where no light would be getting whatsoever. And you can keep pretty dark shadows there because there's no light, so the forms can be a lot starker. When we're talking about the lower abdomen, the degree of fat or roundness is usually what will dictate how the forms are transitioning and looking. So what you want to do is consider, what is the lighting like? How much body fat do they have? What are the shadow shapes doing, and how am I describing the forms with those? No matter how much body fat there is, you're going to have bonier protrusions like around the collarbone, but as you're able to configure some of the various areas based on what kind of tissue it is it soft tissue, is it hard tissue, then you'll be able to shade things a little more appropriately. So again, going for a fairly natural look here. It's very much a rendering game. Reconfiguring and playing with some of the shadow shapes. Squinting to check my shadow shape structure and moving the edges around to get the degree of softness I want. But yeah, shading is always based on surface planes and how light is interacting with those surface planes. So your lighting scenario, what Andrew Loomis calls the form principle, is definitely something to look into and to consider. So I'm going to grab a little bit of lightness to start to pop the forms the other way, toward the light. So just color picked white. Start to move some of the forms that are absorbing the light, some of the surface planes that are very much getting struck by it. Maybe even pull a couple things slightly out of shadow, but still within the shadow's value range. It's a very sharp edge. Probably not something we want. We can just lose that edge entirely. And super thin lines are less perceptible, and thus you can use them to enhance the realism. I'm just going to pull this upper breast portion more towards the light. And that's looking pretty solid. So in essence, just to sort of wrap things up here so the demonstration doesn't get too long, I'm going to offer sort of a recapitulation of some of the things I was talking about. The number one thing to consider is your lighting scenario. Because that will determine your value scale, which is the tones and their differential. So a more crushed value scale can give you a lot more form. The Baroque artist used it a lot, whereas you can go lighter. You know, this is more of a daylight setup where the shadows aren't going to be as stark. This is more of a studio or night setup. And you can just study different lighting scenarios until you understand you know, how far it is from dark to light, right? And again, I go over all this in my beginner drawing course and beginner painting courses. If you can't draw to the point where you can paint, I'd recommend you start there first. Otherwise, the painting course covers values pretty nicely. So yeah, you're just thinking about the value scale and how that is going to affect your tone differential in the room you have to work with. It's easier to self-form pulling from black than it is going from white downward in the value scale. So this is sort of a simple gradient of tone differential right here. Another thing to mention is the bony protrusions. So the bony parts are going to have different form transitions than the soft tissue parts. So those are going to be stark form transition, or starker, which you can think of as not necessarily darker, but more sudden. And then you have soft tissue, which is rounder. You can also consider the amount of body fat for soft tissue. And last but not least, study edges. Edges are important. Edges are how, you know, a form transitions. If we have a really sharp edge like this versus some softer edges like these, you have some really lost edges where you can't even tell where it begins or ends. It's just like a big Gaussian blur. That will really help you turn form, is to understand how edges work and how they work with values and what the forms look like, and when to turn the edge. You know, this is still a little too stark over here. If I were to keep rendering it and softening it, and then I get a more gradual result versus a starker result. So again, a little more stylized, a little more realistic. Edges, lighting scenarios, value scales. I hope this was helpful in terms of being able to understand how to shade the lower abdomen, but also just understanding the fundamentals that drive being able to understand that and parse that. A really good course to check out is the Charles Barg drawing course. That one really helped me understand how to work with form and tone and have more of an academic approach, even though I haven't studied that exclusively. So thank you for watching. Again, I'm Taylor Payton of tapeart.com, powerpainters.org. Feel free to support the channel by liking, subscribing, commenting. Let me know what you're struggling with. If you want to enroll in the courses, send me assignments. I will be happy to give you feedback. Other than that, I will see you in the next video. Take care and happy painting.